Hi, everyone. My name is Lisa McCorkell, and I've had long COVID since March of 2020, and I'm one of the co-founders of the Patient-Led Research Collaborative, who are a group of people with long COVID who conduct research on long COVID. I am one of many millions of people with long COVID, and our numbers continue to grow as COVID spreads. While I am generally a mild case of long COVID, my symptoms impact my everyday life, having developed postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, post-exertional malaise, cognitive dysfunction, fatigue, and premenstrual disorder. As I've tried to participate in clinical trials thus far, I've run into a few barriers. First, there's just not enough happening right now, particularly given the scale and severity of long COVID. Second, despite being heavily involved in long COVID research myself, it takes significant effort to even find clinical trials. Researchers need to better promote their studies to the patient population and not focus solely on recruiting through long COVID clinics, which have many barriers to entry. And third, because I got COVID so early and was not able to be tested, I'm unable to participate in any clinical trials that require a positive COVID test for inclusion. And as Michelle said earlier, it won't just be me who is excluded. A minority of COVID cases have actually been properly documented by PCR due to inaccessibility, and also PCR tests having high false negative rates, particularly among women and people under 40 years old. And antibody tests are also not reliable, as women and people with mild infections are more likely to not seroconvert and serorevert. It's critical for clinical trials to, at minimum, have an arm that allows for clinical diagnoses of COVID so that the millions of people like me can participate. If I am eligible and can find clinical trials, though, there are a few things I would consider before signing up. First, the intervention. As someone who has post-exertional malaise, I would not participate in a clinical trial that is testing graded exercise therapy, as my own baseline has decreased due to exercise, and research shows that this harms people with post-exertional malaise. I would prioritize participating in clinical trials that are testing interventions that have a base in existing evidence on long COVID and other infection onset illnesses, and ones that are of importance to the patient community. These include antivirals, antihistamines, anticoagulants, JAK-STAT inhibitors, and immunomodulators. I would also consider the side effects of the intervention, particularly if there is a high likelihood my symptoms could be permanently made worse on the intervention. But I would be willing to risk some side effects for drugs that are showing promise from patient anecdotes and that test a promising hypothesis. Due to limited energy, as well as risk of getting reinfected with COVID, I would be more likely to participate in a decentralized clinical trial that is fully remote or requires only a few clinic visits. But if the evidence behind the drug is strong and of priority to the patient community, I would consider more in-person clinic visits with additional travel that is reimbursed. However, it's important that trials also give the option to have at-home visits to ensure severe long COVID patients can participate. I would consider the clinical trial design, whether patients are stratified by phenotype, and whether the design is considering and measuring differences based on illness duration, where patients are in their menstrual cycle, any mast cell reactions, post-exertional malaise from clinic visits or the intervention itself, and any potential impact of or to endothelial dysfunction and organ damage. I would prefer to participate in a crossover trial where everyone receives an intervention, but I would also personally be okay with the risk of receiving a placebo as long as I can continue taking other medications and supplements that currently help me somewhat manage my symptoms. In terms of outcomes to prioritize, I would want a trial to ensure clinical significance, that the intervention has a meaningful impact on my life. Ways to measure this include quality of life measures, standardized tools for symptoms and conditions like the DSQ-PEM and Compass 31, and the severity of our most impactful symptoms. And while it is often argued that there are no specific biomarkers for long COVID yet, there are tests that often come back abnormal in people with long COVID and are often pulled from research into overlapping conditions and comorbidities like ME/CFS and dysautonomia. Examples of these include cerebral blood flow, natural killer cell function, T cell functioning, microclots, and levels of reactivated virus. Overall, there are millions of patients who desperately need well-designed, accessible trials testing therapeutics that are a priority to the patient community. Excuses of no definitive biomarker or murky endpoints are not acceptable. There are ways to do this well, and we need to do it now. Thank you.